Brothers and sisters of Africa, listen closely and do not turn away. My comrades, my fellow voices in this rising storm, today I speak not with trembling lips, not with lowered eyes, but with the fire of freedom burning through my veins. They drew a line in ink. We drew ours in blood. This is not justice. This is not law. This is empire wearing a judge's robe, hiding behind bureaucracy, hoping we will not see the chains hidden in their paperwork. They call it a warrant. We call it a warning. Because if one man's defiance terrifies them this much, imagine what millions could do. Interpol may stamp their red notices. France may whisper behind closed doors. The United States may tighten sanctions. The European Union may wag its diplomatic finger. But no document written in the comfort of Brussels can erase the hunger for dignity rising in Ouagadougou. Stay with me, for this is not just a man on trial. It is Africa on the brink of remembering who she is, and history is watching. It came quietly, as it always does. Not with sirens, not with courts, but with a signature, a red stamp on white paper. A notice dispatched from somewhere in Europe, crafted in boardrooms, approved in embassies and delivered through Interpol. A warrant, not against a criminal, but against a man who dared to say no. A man who stood on African soil and said, "We will not kneel." Not to France, not to the United States, not to anyone. The warrant for Ibrahim Traoré, leader of Burkina Faso, arrived with the cold language of legality, wanted for destabilizing actions, undermining regional security, associations with non-aligned actors. But strip away the phrasing, and what remains is this. He challenged empire, and empire responded, not with debate, but with a red card. In Brussels, they called it necessary. In Paris, they called it overdue. In Washington, they nodded quietly. But in Ouagadougou, in Bamako, in Niamey, and beyond, the people called it exactly what it was, a threat dressed as law. Within hours, the warrant spread, not as fear, but as fire. On radios, through WhatsApp chains, in university dorms and village gatherings, the word was out. They're trying to silence Traoré. They're trying to make an example of him. They're trying to remind us who writes the rules. But something had shifted. The old tools of control, sanctions, arrest warrants, diplomatic isolation no longer held the same weight. Because Africa had seen this before. We remember Lumumba, dragged and murdered under Belgian order. We remember Thomas Sankara, gunned down in a coup plotted in French whispers. We remember Gaddafi, bombed beneath the banners of NATO. And now with Traoré, the cycle returned. But this time something resisted. Something ancient and new at once, consciousness. In Burkina Faso, thousands poured into the streets, not in panic, but in defiance. Not to deny the charges, but to deny their legitimacy. Protesters held signs not of apology, but of affirmation. We are not your subjects. Our gold, our voice, wanted by them, chosen by us. Flags waved, drums beat, and across the dusty roads of West Africa, a question thundered louder than any Interpol statement. Since when did sovereignty become a crime? Because that is what lay beneath the surface. Not weapons, not conspiracies, but sovereignty. Traoré had expelled French troops. He had shut foreign mining contracts. He had begun redirecting wealth not to Paris, but to the people. He had refused to be managed. And that, more than any speech, any alliance, any policy, is what triggered the warrant. Western analysts, seated in think tanks thousands of miles away, spoke of populism, nationalism, geopolitical friction. But the people called it what it was, a continent waking up. The warrant was never meant to reach the people. It was meant to shame the leadership, to isolate, to intimidate. But it failed. In fact, it did the opposite. It became a mirror, reflecting a truth many had tried to ignore. The tools of international order are often the tools of old empires, polished, renamed, and redeployed. The red notice turned into a red flag of rebellion. What was meant to chain one man unleashed millions. Artists painted murals of Traoré with chains breaking behind him. Musicians released protest songs. Hashtags surge. In Africa will not bow. One we're Traore. One our minerals our future. In cafes and classrooms, students debated the meaning of legal neutrality. Elders recalled how foreign powers once called Mandela a terrorist. Young mothers asked how a man building schools could be branded a threat. Even some within Interpol began to question, was this justice or geopolitics? Was this neutrality or obedience to power? The silence from African Union leaders grew heavier by the day. Some whispered disapproval. Others waited. But the people, unlike institutions, had made up their mind. The warrant was not a mark of shame. It was a badge of fear, theirs, not ours. In a speech that circulated shortly after the notice, a Burkina Faso youth leader declared, "They have paper. We have the soil. They have laws. We have memory. They have power. We have people." That sentiment spread faster than any news broadcast. Because in the hearts of millions, something had already been decided. No matter what Interpol wrote, the soul of Africa was not up for negotiation. By the time Western news outlets published their op-eds, describing Traoré as a firebrand and a regional destabilizer, the narrative had already shifted. This was no longer about one man. It was about what he represented. The warrant was not merely a legal act. It was a line in the sand. And across that line stood a generation unwilling to crawl. But was this truly about one man? Or was it the first shot in a larger war over the soul of Africa? They thought the warrant would isolate him, but it ignited something they could not control. In the hours that followed Interpol's red notice against Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso did not fall silent. It rose. In the streets of Ouagadougou, the response was immediate, not orchestrated, not ordered, but organic. Thousands poured into city squares. Women carried portraits of Traoré, not because he was flawless, but because he was fearless. Children chanted his name, not out of indoctrination, but instinct. Old men raised fists, remembering the last time a man dared to say, "We are not your colony." From Bobo Dioulasso to Kaya, the air was electric. Not with panic, but purpose. Protesters didn't demand clarification. They didn't ask for a defense. They declared a position: if they want him, they'll have to go through all of us. Flags waved, not just of Burkina Faso, but of Mali, Niger, Guinea. Unity stitched together by centuries of struggle in a single wound: exploitation. The West called it populism. Africa called it awakening. Social media became a furnace. Images of Traoré, fists clenched, beret firm, eyes steady, were pasted across platforms with captions like, "This is our generation, Sankara." Music videos emerged overnight, pairing revolutionary lyrics with drone footage of protests. Artists sketched him standing beneath thunderclouds, his silhouette surrounded by ancestors: Lumumba, Sankara, Nkrumah, Mandela. Not as idols, but as warnings. When Africa produces leaders who love her, they don't grow old. The comparison was not poetic, it was strategic. Because everyone watching knew what came next in the old script. First, the isolation. Then the warrant. Then the accident. The plane crash. The bullet. The betrayal. That is why whispers of the assassination of Ibrahim Traoré didn't shock, they echoed. Like a song Africa had been forced to memorize. That fear did not paralyze, it politicized. And this time the people vowed, never again. In universities, as students held forums titled Lawfare and Liberation. In markets, women refused to accept foreign aid packages stamped with EU flags. In mosques and churches, prayers were offered not just for protection, but for resistance. What was once abstract imperialism, neocolonialism, extraction, suddenly had a face, a date, a document, a target. And yet what made this moment extraordinary was not simply the fury, but the clarity. The people knew the danger didn't lie only in bullets, but in narratives. Western media described the protests as unrest, instability, pro-Traoré loyalism. They used the same phrases once reserved for Mandela in the 1960s, Sankara in the 1980s, and Chavez in the 2000s. But the people had learned a new language, the language of discernment. They recognized framing when they saw it, and they refused to be written out of their own revolution. One viral clip captured a young Burkina Faso woman, no older than 22, standing on a rooftop, holding up a hand-drawn sign. Interpol has red paper. We have red blood. Let them come. Another post showed elders burning a copy of the warrant in a village square, declaring, "Our ancestors were hunted. We won't let it happen again." It wasn't just protest, it was cultural memory reactivated. It was the trauma of generations repurposed as energy. And in every chant, every march, every shared message, the same vow echoed: Traore is not alone. And he wasn't. The dominoes had already begun to tip. In Mali, ministers issued statements of solidarity. In Niger, military leaders invoked the same language of dignity and sovereignty. Guinea called for an emergency regional summit, not to condemn, but to question. When does justice stop being justice and start becoming a weapon? And beyond West Africa, even in Kenya, Senegal, and South Africa, civil society groups began organizing solidarity rallies. Meanwhile, Traoré remained silent. No press statement, no interview, no apology. And that silence spoke louder than any declaration. It said, "I will not dignify the theater." It forced the world to focus not on his rebuttal, but on their own overreach. And that silence became strategy. Because while the institutions scrambled to defend the warrant as procedural, the people had already reframed it as political. And in the battle between procedure and principle, Africa had chosen. Not because of blind loyalty, but because they knew this wasn't about Ibrahim Traoré the man. It was about who they were allowed to become, about whether any African leader could ever say no and live to govern. So they marched, not for immunity, but for identity, not for one man's name, but for their children's right to say, "This continent is ours." But if millions are now awake, what will they do when the world tries to put them back to sleep? They said it was about law, but the truth lies deeper in the soil. It lies beneath the forests of Congo, beneath the dust of Niger's deserts, beneath the rivers of gold and veins of uranium that stretch across West Africa. The real reason for the red notice against Ibrahim Traoré was not his rhetoric. It was his reach. His hand touched something sacred in the eyes of empire, the right to own what lies beneath his land. Before the warrant, there were contracts. Foreign mining companies had operated in Burkina Faso for decades, extracting gold by the ton, exporting it in quiet partnership with governments too afraid or too complicit to say no. For years, billions were made while villages near the mines drank from dirty wells and schools crumbled in the heat. Then came Traoré, and with him, a declaration: "We will not dig for others while our own people starve." Within months, his government suspended several foreign licenses. They demanded renegotiations. They redirected a share of profits into national development. They insisted on audits. And they began discussions with nations outside the Western sphere, not to sell, but to partner. That was the turning point. In the language of geopolitics, it was called resource nationalism. In the language of the streets, it was called justice. And Traoré was not alone. Mali had begun nationalizing gold assets. Niger had started questioning the colonial-era contracts around uranium, especially those that fed France's nuclear energy grid while millions of Nigerians lived without electricity. The pattern was forming, and the message was clear. Africa will no longer be the fuel of foreign wealth. But that kind of message carries a price. To Western observers, the headlines were unsettling. Phrases like increased Russian presence, loss of Western influence, uncertain investment climate filled economic reports. But for ordinary Africans, Ibrahim Traoré news meant something else entirely. It meant someone had finally stood up. It meant someone had dared to say, "We will keep what is ours." That shift from supplier to sovereign is what made Traoré dangerous. Not because he carried weapons, but because he carried a question. Why must the continent richest in resources remain the poorest in return? It is a question that rattles boardrooms and haunts policymakers. Because the answer is uncomfortable. It is about systems built not on fairness, but on extraction. About global financial institutions that lend with one hand and take with the other. About trade deals written in English and French, but never in the interests of Africa. About aid that arrives with cameras and contracts that arrive with conditions. When Traoré rejected those terms, he wasn't just breaking deals. He was breaking a code, the unspoken rule that Africa may rise, but only in ways permitted by its former masters. And so the red notice followed, not because he stole, but because he refused to be stolen from. In Burkina Faso, the shift was immediate. State-run projects began in earnest. Local industries received increased funding. The government spoke of refining its own gold, building its own infrastructure, and training its own youth. Was it perfect? No. Was it revolutionary? Absolutely. But the pushback came just as fast. Economic pressure, media campaigns, think tanks warning of instability, even whispers of regional isolation, all framed in the language of concern, of legality, of peace. But the people read between the lines. A radio host in Mali summed it up best. When they control your land, it's called investment. When you take it back, it's called rebellion. This is the cost of ownership. To claim Africa's resources is to invite consequences. To audit contracts is to threaten balance sheets in cities thousands of miles away. To say our gold must build our schools is to be branded a disruptor. And in a world where the disruptors are hunted, not for what they do, but for what they symbolize, Traoré became a target. But even as the threats mounted, the movement did not shrink. On the contrary, it grew. In South Africa, trade unions voiced support. In Ghana, youth groups called for a continental summit on mineral sovereignty. In the diaspora, from Paris to Toronto, Africans marched not for aid, but for accountability. Because beneath every conversation about Traoré, one truth kept rising. Africa's poverty is not natural. It is engineered. It is profitable for someone. And Ibrahim Traoré news was beginning to make that someone very uncomfortable. What happens when Africa stops asking permission and starts collecting what it's owed? For decades, the world was told that Interpol was neutral, above politics, beyond influence, a guardian of global justice. But when the red notice came down on Ibrahim Traoré, that illusion began to crack. In Paris, it was met with silence and knowing glances. In Brussels, the European Union offered carefully crafted statements about respecting international law and concerns over democratic backsliding. In Washington, officials echoed the same script, emphasizing regional stability and security threats. But in Ouagadougou, the message landed differently. It sounded like a verdict written before the trial. They called him undemocratic, yet no one asked who elected the foreign companies extracting gold from his soil. They called him destabilizing, yet ignored the destabilization that comes when a nation cannot feed itself while its resources enrich others. The hypocrisy was not new. What changed was how clearly it was now visible. For every statement of concern, there was a memory. Libya, where a humanitarian intervention led to a failed state. Côte d'Ivoire, where a disputed election ended with Western boots and a friendly president. DR Congo, where silence followed every massacre not involving Western nationals. And so, the red notice was seen for what it was, not a signal of guilt, but a symbol of interference. A message to every African leader: stay in line or face consequences. Even the African Union, long criticized for cautious diplomacy, began to show signs of unease. While it did not officially condemn the warrant, senior officials expressed reservations about the process. ECOWAS remained divided, torn between old loyalties and new realities. In this tension, a dangerous possibility began to emerge, not spoken loudly, but present in every conversation. If the warrant fails, what comes next? The word lingered like smoke. Assassination of Ibrahim Traoré. Not as prophecy, not as conspiracy, but as memory. Because history has taught Africans that when defiance cannot be contained by paper, other means are found. And it is precisely that fear that history may repeat itself, that galvanized even those who once doubted him. What the West underestimated was not Traoré's popularity, but the clarity of the African street. People who may not follow geopolitics now understand patterns. They've seen the same faces smile before sanctions. The same embassies fund democracy workshops one year, then endorse coups the next. The same media houses that celebrate resistance in Europe call it extremism in Africa. So when Interpol acts, it is no longer seen as an impartial actor. It is seen as a weapon with a badge, a bureaucratic bullet. And what they fear most now is that Africa is learning faster than they can rebrand. What happens when the continent that was once divided by borders finds unity and resistance? No arrest warrant, however global, can predict the future, but it can provoke it. In the days since the Interpol notice against Ibrahim Traoré, the continent has stood at a crossroads, not just of legality, but of destiny. What happens next will depend not on the paper that was signed in Europe, but on the will that rises from African soil. One path leads to escalation. Sanctions may follow. Foreign investment may retreat. Rumors of coups may fester in shadows, encouraged by those who find profit in instability. The threat of isolation looms, not only from global finance, but from regional institutions still tethered to external influence. And yes, the specter of violence, ever present in the pages of African resistance, remains. The fear that the fire lit in Burkina Faso could be extinguished not by debate, but by a bullet. That the name Ibrahim Traoré might one day be carved into the same tragic stone as Sankara, Lumumba, Cabral. That fear is real. But there is another path, one forged not in negotiation rooms, but in classrooms and farmlands, in copper mines and community councils. It is the path of sovereign cooperation, of regional trade without colonial middlemen, of resource processing within the continent, of policy aligned not with aid, but with ambition. This path sees alliances not dictated by East or West, but by need and dignity. It imagines a West Africa whose gold does not leave as dust, but returns as infrastructure. A Sahel that does not export laborers but engineers. A Burkina Faso that no longer measures its budget in donor percentages, but in its own harvest. Traoré's stand, whatever one thinks of his methods, has opened that conversation, and more importantly, it has made retreat impossible. The youth have heard something they cannot unhear, that Africa can say no. That dignity is not just a dream, but a decision. That sovereignty is not gifted, it is reclaimed. Even if Traoré were to fall, the wave he rides is not his alone. Already new leaders are emerging, new movements forming, new questions rising, and each one begins where old politics ends, with the refusal to obey quietly. This moment, then, is not only about Burkina Faso. It is about what kind of Africa will rise from the weight of its own history. Will the next chapter be written in ink or in courage? They issued a warrant, hoping to end a chapter. But what they sparked was a continent writing a new one. What began as a bureaucratic document has become a battle cry echoing across cities and savannas, into dormitories and village squares, across borders and bloodlines. The world may frame this as just another headline in the stream of Ibrahim Traoré news. But to millions it is a signal, a sign that the era of quiet obedience has ended, that the soil has memory and memory has awoken. This is no longer about whether one man defied a system. It is about whether a system built on extraction, coercion, and control can survive the refusal of a generation to be managed. The threat was never Ibrahim Traoré. The threat was the possibility that others would follow, that young Africans, miners, mothers, mayors would see that resistance is not a crime and sovereignty is not a favor. The fear is not rebellion, it is reinvention. Yes, the dangers remain. Whispers of the assassination of Ibrahim Traoré still linger because history leaves fingerprints. But even if such a tragedy were to unfold, the idea he carried will not bleed with him, because ideas rooted in justice do not die. They grow, and so the question is no longer what Interpol will do. The question is, what will Africa do with this moment? Will it wait for permission to rise or rise regardless? Will it repeat the past or reclaim the future? One thing is clear, Ibrahim Traoré news is not just about a man, it is about the millions who now speak his language. The language of land reclaimed, of contracts rewritten, of children no longer born into debt. History is watching, and it will remember not the paper that was signed, but the people who refused to be silenced. If this voice stirs something in you, let it live beyond this video. Share it, speak it, spread it, not for one man, but for the Africa that refuses to bow,